My name's Paul Hatch. I work as a service manager in planning and housing strategy within Lancaster City Council's planning and climate change service. So I'm responsible for preparing local development plans. And I'm joined today by Susanna Dart, who's our Principal Climate Change Officer here at Lancaster. We're both members of the Soils Task Force, which is a public-private sector collaboration to investigate opportunities to promote the role and importance of soils. The task force involves colleagues not just from Lancaster City Council, but also Cornwall County Council, Lancaster University, and a range of private sector and industry stakeholders. And we're here today to give you some perspective in relation to a local planning authority's view on the future role of soil management in the construction and planning process. We'd like to introduce you to the latest publication from the Soils Task Force, which includes a soils management policy around soil management in the development process, which we hope in the future can be used within local development plans. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon? Well, firstly, I'm going to give you some background into the role of the Soils Task Force and its participants. Then I'll give you some context in terms of why looking after soils is so important and why they should have a greater presence within local plans. I'll go on to provide you with some direction in terms of what national planning policy says about soils and soil management. Then I'll pass over to Susanna to introduce the content and direction of that model soil policy, its expectations, its requirements, and how it can be implemented through the plan making process. And finally, we'll wrap up with posing some frequently asked questions about its practical application in the planning process moving forward. So in the way of a bit of context, the Soils Task Force began as a collaboration back in 2022 to explore a series of principles around better management of soils in our planning and construction processes. It's developed It's developed a public and private sector voice, which hopes to raise the awareness and importance of soils, exploring opportunities in which we can promote the issue and seek to support the adoption of good soil policy across the development industry. And the people who participate in the Soils Task Force are really wide and varied. Whilst it's led by colleagues at Lancaster and Cornwall Councils, the Lancaster University, master planners at JTP, and landscape architects Farrah Huxley, we also work with a wide range of experts to explore issues around soil management through the widest lens possible. And at the starting point, a bit of a shameless plug here. If you find this presentation interesting and you do want to work with the Soils Task Force in the future, then the door to new participants is always open. You can get in touch with us via the Soils Task Force website, because we're always open to new members and new points of view on how we can take this issue forward. So let's start at the beginning. Why are soils so important to us? I'm sure many of us don't need reminding in the value of soils, but I do think it's worth reiterating the reasons why the issue is so important in the first place, and why we as planners need to think more about it as we look to prepare local plans. Besides water and oxygen, soil is one of the most important building blocks for life. It's fundamental to many, if not all, of our natural ecosystems, but it also governs our ability to grow food, shapes our landscape, and strongly influences our relationship with the built environment. Because every structure, building, place, and space has an interaction with the ground below it. Strong and long-standing foundations are vital to every construction process, but that relationship shouldn't just be simply a consideration of whether the ground is stable enough to ensure a building doesn't fall down. It's not unreasonable to say that our thoughts need to be given to the impact that built environment has on the soil beneath it, and minimize the damage that humans can have on the value and role that soils provide. The construction process can hold many dangers to the integrity and values of our soils. Some of the processes and stresses that we put soils through in terms of soil stripping, engineering, movement, compaction, storage, can have long-term damaging consequences, which can be difficult for soils to recover from. And those consequences can be severe. Overcompaction of soil, for example, can lead to greater risks from flooding, standing water, and surface water runoff, which at times of high rainfall can compromise the integrity of new developments, and at worst can be a risk to human life. Unnecessary movements of the wrong soil can lead to large emissions of carbon into our atmosphere, fueling the impacts of climate change. You might think some of those statements in the last slide lack a bit of substance, but here are some clear statistics. So in 2018, 10 times the amount of soil was lost to construction as it was lost to erosion. That equates to about 29.5 million tonnes of soil, and that has a sale value of around £2.7 billion. Soil holds 59% of all biodiversity. 46% of new homes are built on greenfield land, which turns that land into urban soil. The compaction of soil can reduce water infiltration rates by between 70 to 99%. Soil biodiversity can be harmed through compaction due to stockpiling, storage, or heavy vehicle traffic because it leads to a lack of oxygen. Soil sealing has increased from 4,500 hectares per year in the 2000s up to 15,800 hectares per year by the period 2013 to 2018. So some really startling facts there in terms of what impacts we can have on soil quality and soil value. So what can we as planners do to better understand the impacts and the consequences of poor soil management? Well, as planners, we tend to always start with our thoughts about what does the National Planning Policy Framework say? And that's not really any different with the issues around soil management. So what does the framework say? Well, up until recently, it said very little on the subject of soil management. Yes, there's been some direction on the protection of soils in regard to the most versatile grades of agricultural land, but there's been little or nothing in relation to the broader issue of good soil management within the development process. But that's subtly beginning to change with the most recent version of the framework published in late 2024. And most notably, its reference in paragraph 187 of the framework, which I've highlighted in this slide. Here, the framework is now suggesting that both policies and decisions around development and their impact on the natural environment should consider the impacts of soils. This assessment does appear to be a subjective one. It's not become an issue of soundness for a local plan, but it has now opened the door for each individual planning authority to make its own decisions around how they best protect the values of soils within their development plan. The framework is clear that the onus will be on individual planning authorities to set their own agenda around soil protection, and the implications of the statement and identified quality in the development plan means that it will be for each plan itself to set out a mechanism around the status and subsequent protection of soils. Arguably, the framework could go further on this issue of soil management, but for the purposes of the model policy, the references to the framework now realistically open the door for further investigation of this issue and provides the necessary justification for addressing soil management within emerging development plans. So why does the inclusion of a soils management policy in your emerging plan really matter? And what do we see currently? Well, at the moment, any sort of approach towards soil management is what you would expect, fragmented. Indeed, the planning framework, National Planning Policy Framework itself is almost encouraging that fragmented approach towards this issue by leaving it up to individual planning authorities to forge their own path on this issue. Some will do nothing, some will take it seriously, some will do a lot, and some might do a little. It will undoubtedly lead to an inconsistent approach on this issue. But clearly there is potential to enact some positive change. The shift on this matter can come from this more local level of plan making, which can drive some clear direction. When looking at soil management in construction, then the planning process, and particularly the plan making process, is at the very start of your thinking on this issue, which means the opportunities to deliver positive change are at their greatest. But to capture that potential and deal with the issues of consistency and fragmentation of approach, then clearly local planning authorities are going to need some help. So as part of the Soils Task Force, we felt the best way to provide that help is by giving planning authorities the opportunity to use model planning policies in relation to this issue, which can act as a consistent starting point in providing some direct guidance on positive planning for soil management. And with that, I'll pass over to my colleague, Susanna, who will take us through some detail of that model policy. Over to you, Susanna.
Thanks so much, Paul. So the first thing we need to understand is Can I get the next slide, Paul? No worries. First, as Paul's mentioned, soils are really, really critical, and we have to accept also that soil and its value is not a renewable resource. The damage that we do through the construction process is incredibly difficult to undo, and in many cases, it's impossible. We have to genuinely recognize this intrinsic value of soil. It's not simply dirt, and it holds great value for a wide range of the many things that we rely on. If we misuse soil, it's at our own peril. And for the reasons that have been mentioned by Paul earlier, we need to give soil the respect it deserves. So what is the soil management policy there to achieve? We're focusing on better outcomes for new development, but as with all local aspects of the local plan, the other direct consequence is really also better education around the value and role that soils play in the environment around us, and the impacts that development can have on that role and value. So let's take a look at why we're protecting soils in the first place. Paul's touched on that. And as part of the work that we did in developing this policy, there are some specific things that we need that make it more than dirt. As part of the engagement with the industry experts across this work and across the country, there were 3 key themes that came out. The first one was that we need to protect, manage, and enhance soils for the betterment of the natural environment. This is because it's the basis of all life. It's absolutely critical for carbon storage. We need it for food production. It's the homes for both above and below ground biodiversity, and we need it for climate regulation. The model policy is going to make sure that this value and functionality of soil is protected and make sure that we've got healthy places for communities while maximizing the benefit for the natural environment. The other theme that came out was protecting, managing, and enhancing soils for their role in water management. We've got to be really careful around soils because they are absolutely key to water management, both for drought and for flooding, and for keeping and for clean and healthy waterways. And we also have to recognize soils as a finite resource. They are not a renewable resource, and we misuse them at our peril. Can I get the next slide, please? So hopefully you've had a chance to look at the model policy, but we're going to go through a quick run through of the main policy, and then as well as a couple other policy areas. It's really important to note that we're going to be looking to make requirements of new development, but it needs to come from an evidential base, and it needs to be made, and to make informed decisions, we need to have the right information submitted as part of a planning application, so it doesn't result in unnecessary and unavoidable delays in determining planning applications. The expectations also around soil management, what's really important is they're not there to delay the delivery of development. It's really just to make sure that the decisions around the development ensure sustainable development, which has positive long-term outcomes for soil quality and critically the communities there. Can I get the next slide, please? Okay, so in the report, which you can download, one of the things that we realized is that local authorities needed a model policy that they could build off. So within the report, we've got a main soils policy that you can adapt to your local circumstances. You can just plug it right in. And then we've also provided 3 sets of supporting text around the natural water management, the natural environment, and soils for carbon mitigation and net zero. And that allows you to take those policies and plug them into other existing policies across your local plan areas to make sure that soils are treated holistically across the policy areas in the plan where they impact. Okay, the next slide. Okay, so today we're really going to focus just on the main policy text. So there's 3 main aspects to that. The first strand of information that we need out of that for that policy is that we need a baseline report on the current soil conditions and qualities on your development site. The development industry already does a great job at understanding ground conditions and stability in terms of whether land's capable of being built on, but this is essentially taking that information and adding to it and looking at it through different prisms. we need to really understand what is the soil quality, how are we going to protect it where we need to, and how can we manage it as better part of the construction process. It's really important that this assessment is undertaken prior to any works taking place on the site and before any soil has been tampered with. Slide. Moving on to the second stage of the policy and also the second stage of the construction process. This is the most detailed request of the soils management policy. Once we've got the baseline position, then the construction phase management plan needs to set out the management processes which are going to be undertaken during the construction of the site. This needs to follow the soil hierarchy, which is first, we need to avoid the disturbance of soil wherever possible. When you can't, minimize that disturbance. If there's disturbance of soil, then look for opportunities to reuse that within the site. And finally, where there is disturbance and potential for damage, that there must be efforts made to remediate and bring back the soil to its original condition. Key to the management plan is the identification of soil protection zones within the development site. And these are really zones that we're looking to be completely protected from disturbance. These might be areas where there's highly sensitive soil types, for instance, peat or peaty soils, or areas of soil around natural features such as mature trees, or it might be areas where you're going to be bringing biodiversity net gain forward. It may also zone less sensitive areas for places of soil storage during the construction process. Management plan really needs to carefully consider the implications of soil movement, both within and off of the site. And thinking back to the soils hierarchy, we need to really, really focus on moving as little soil as possible and leaving as much of it in situ as possible. We do realize it's important to be pragmatic. Using a greenfield site for development is going to have impact on soil. In developing the sites, though, what's important is that we understand what those impacts will be, minimize the impact, and have a plan for how we're managing the soil across that development. Next. The last one is that now that we've got the baseline understanding of soil, we've got a management plan for the construction phase. The final piece of the policy is how the actions are going to be set out within the management plan to be monitored during the construction phase of the site. So this element of it needs to really set out how they're going to be managed and monitored. So we can't just have a plan, we also need to monitor that plan. And this needs to be set out as part of the planning application process so the local planning authority can be confident that that will be effectively monitored. Part of the engagement has really identified as well that often there may be best intentions at the design phase, or there may be best intentions at the application phase, but that isn't necessarily translated down to those that are delivering the site. And so that monitoring part is really critical. These checks need to strike the right balance to better ensure there's sufficient rigor to the process, but aren't overly onerous or burdensome on the development process, both for the industry and for the overstretched resources of your local planning authority. It isn't set out in the thing how, in the model, how this will be done. So that will be up to each planning authority. But most logical would be to tie this to the monitoring arrangements to some sort of planning condition, which can be discharged at the relevant part of the construction process. If you haven't already, you can scan this QR code or click the link in the chat to download it. Also, you can visit the soilstaskforce.com/reports for more research and guides that we've done around soils and construction.
Okay, so we've talked through the model soil policy, and there's clearly quite a lot of reading that you can kind of get up to in terms of the accompanying literature for this. But we thought we'd finish up by preempting a few questions that you might be thinking about. So Susanna, I'll take these separately. So first one has the policy been through public examination? Well, no, not as yet. It's Lancaster's expectation that it will be looking to incorporate the model policy into its own emerging local plan, which is in the early stages of preparation. And it's hoped that others will follow in due course using the model policy approach.
Awesome. The next one we've gotten a lot is, does the implementation of the soils policy require expert input? And our hope is no. There's enough technical burdens on the planning process already for development management colleagues. And if we want this approach to soils management to be realistic, the data provided and its assessment needs to be simple and pragmatic. So we need to have data submitted in a way that non-technical experts can understand, without clear outcomes that are with direction that's robust and simple to undertake.
Okay, does the requirement for better soils management pose a viability challenge for developers? It shouldn't. This is about the development industry doing something extra. It isn't about the development industry doing something extra. It's about the development industry doing things differently. This is about process and method. It's not about the need for more infrastructure or financial contributions. Having thought for soils is not a monetary cost, but it is about recognizing the wider value of soil and having thought for long-term consequences of how it's treated.
The other question we get about a lot is how we can link soils management policy within the wider ambitions of the plan. We've provided, again, 3 pieces of text for different areas in your plan. So that's a great start to better address this. Again, the National Planning Policy Framework, it's down to the individual planning authority to determine the level of importance given to this issue. And we've, again, in the report, set out further policy suggestions and how you can raise the profile of soils within your emerging plans, but also feel free to see where else you can put soils in to make sure that you're holistically addressing it. The other one is the resource implications for monitoring and management of policy requirements. So we'd expect the submission and approval of the soil management assessment to be part of the planning application. But what's really, really important is that this is followed through, because otherwise this will be a waste if the development commences and it's not monitored. So it does need to be properly managed and monitored to make sure that that soil management plan is followed. And this we're expecting to be achieved through discharge of conditions attached to the planning approval.
Okay, what does the development industry think about this approach? Well, only time will tell in terms of discussions on emerging local plans. But what I would say is we have, as part of the Soils Task Force work, tried to engage with a pretty wide group of stakeholders on the Soils project, and that's included those within the industry. And I'd probably summarize their perceptions of future soil management policy as cautious support. I think they do see the benefits of better practice on this and some clear guidelines. They can also see benefits in terms of better efficiency and outcomes, but of course they have concern and a bit of caution over whether it means spending more money on this issue. And the last question we've got up there is, what are the task force ambitions for the model policy? Well, I think firstly, being at events like this and raising the profile of good soil management is a really great start, and trying to amplify the message around the benefits of good soil management and the role that can play is going to be critical in terms of moving this issue up the agenda. But perhaps in terms of more tangible outcomes, it will be over time seeing the consideration of soil management being given greater weight in planning decisions, whether that's decisions on planning applications themselves or the emergence of planning policies within local plans. And with that, if there are any other questions, thanks very much everyone for your time today. If you do have questions, we'll be absolutely delighted to try and answer them.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Paul and Susanna. That was very clear and coming in under 30 minutes allotted, which is absolutely perfect, what we like to see. Just to say, we have had some few questions come in, but there's still time. If you want to ask Paul and Susanna questions, do put them ideally in the Q&A tab, so then I can see them all in one place and people can vote for which questions they really want Paul and Susanna to answer. So I'm going to start. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask a question. Maybe actually, Paul, if you stop sharing your screen, so then we can have the 3 of us on on the screen. There we go. Lovely to see your faces as well. So kind of following on from that final frequently asked question about the task force's ambitions, what are the biggest barriers you think you face in getting the model policy taken up and implemented by LPAs across the country?
I think I'll probably start, and if Susanna's got anything to add. I think the two things that strike me, and again, being the planner in the room, national planning policy could do more. I think, again, you have this kind of very subjective approach. It's great that there's reference now within national planning policy to the wider protection of soils, not just around agricultural issues, but it is going to potentially create that fragmented approach. And that's going to be a challenge for local planning authorities to implement effective planning policies on this issue. So I think we'd like to see more within national planning policy around the issue, providing a bit more of a consistent approach. And I do think there's, I alluded to it in that frequently asked questions. I think the development industry certainly see value in this in terms of consistent approaches and benefits. But we certainly need to work with them more to have them fully understand the process and buy into it. So I think those are the two kind of key issues for me. But I don't know, Susanna, have you got anything else you want to kind of add?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think like one of the things that we've noticed the most is the education part. Most people just really don't actually know how absolutely critical and important soils are, and the multifunctional roles they play, and also how much they're disturbed. I mean, like Paul said, for example, that like the carbon that's lost from them, that's actually equivalent to the carbon emissions from the cement industry in the UK. So we're really into like decarbonizing that industry, but why aren't we then thinking about the soils that are getting lost from improper management of soils? So it's really that education piece, and that's also something we really emphasized with this last piece of work, is making sure to get the work out there, how we communicate the importance, and is something that we also, like through things like this, are really looking to do.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I definitely agree. Soil needs better PR, 100%. Even that's, one stat you were talking about in terms of the comparable emissions to the kind of cement industry, like that would be, even if we just got that out there to people, I think that would surprise a lot of people. Great, thank you. So on to the questions from the Q&A tab. We have a question from Sally who asks, where do you think this should sit in local councils, and who should regulate any soils management plan and condition for an approved development?
So I'll start again. I think from my perspective, it is very much kind of something that needs to sit within our development management teams as part of the application process. I think there's a really fine balance to that, because obviously development management officers are not soil experts. So I think we need to make sure that the processes we put in place to assess soil condition and create conditions, discharge conditions, need to be simple for everyone to understand. But I certainly see that the responsibility of progressing that would be through having effective planning policies which can be implemented by our development management colleagues in the council. Susanna, I don't know if have you got something to add there?
No, but I think that's exactly it, is that we need it to be, that's where that sits. And so whatever we do needs to be able to be delivered by through development management.
Okay, great. Thanks both. And then a question from Emma who says, is sustainable management of surplus soils included in policy to address the needs for finding suitable offsite options rather than becoming waste disposal at the end of projects? Yeah,
so we have not included that within there. So we've definitely used the soil management hierarchy. So we want to reduce the amount of soil that leaves the site at all. But what happens to it off-site hasn't been addressed within this. That is something, though, that DEFRA is working on right now. And so hopefully there will be some more guidance on that soon. But again, we're focused on what happens to it up until it leaves the development site.
Okay, perfect. Thanks both. Great.
But that doesn't mean other people can't go further.
Yeah.
So yes.
100%.
Like take this as a starting point and then go forth.
Love that. Okay, so next we have a question from Chris that says, at East Devon, DC, we frequently impose a condition requiring a soil resource plan referencing construction code of practice for the sustainable use of soils and construction sites, DEFRA, September 2009. Is this practice note still appropriate?
Yes, so that's the most up-to-date guidance, so continue to reference that because that's the most what's there. But there is another one that's expected. It's been delayed for though almost 2 years, so hopefully that will come soon.
Yeah, watch this space.
Yeah, but until then, that's it.
Great, thank you. Then from Kate Baker, are the carbon sequestration capabilities of soils taken into account when LPAs evaluate their progress towards net zero? And is the carbon generation of cement from developments taken into account in the opposite direction?
Okay, so this was exactly the problem, is that generally that isn't taken into account when LPAs evaluate their progress towards net zero. And so that was something that we were also looking to change as part of this. But again, a lot of that I think has to do with a lack of understanding of the critical role that soils play, and also the cumulative effect of development across LPA's area. So I would really encourage, if you are doing any carbon accounting for your developments, to work towards having that put into your plan.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. And then there's a lot of questions coming in, which is great. Another question. Oh, firstly, just to address Ruth's question about sharing the slides. I can absolutely share the slides, Ruth. If you want a copy, just drop me an email. I'll put my email in the chat in a second. We have another question from Kate. Is the intention then that Lancaster's emerging local plan will identify areas that should not be included in areas designated for example, housing based on soil characteristics? For example, importance for flooding mitigation or good quality soils that are a benefit to carbon sequestration.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So yeah, the council, as most councils are when they're preparing a local plan, will be doing a strategic site assessment of all sites which are suggested to us to find potential allocations. And as part of that assessment process, we'll be looking at land suitability for a range of factors, and soils will be one of those. So just for example, we have an understanding of where our peat is. So we'll certainly be making sure that if we allocate land in those kind of peaty areas, those are left aside. We also have a decision to make around some of our strategic allocations around whether we embed some of this soil management practice within the allocation itself. So what we've talked about today in terms of the model policy, that's a generic policy that our development management colleagues will use, but that's not to say that when we look at some of these larger allocations that we make within a plan, that we don't identify specific areas of that allocation for soil management purposes. So that's certainly something that, again, any authority can look at. They can look at the generic nature of soil management, and we've done the presentation on that today, but you can look at it on a site-by-site basis, particularly if the large strategic sites where there's an opportunity for that kind of management practice to be embedded.
Thanks very much. And then a question from Susan. Is there any advice on how to reduce soil sealing and alternatives to concrete and asphalt?
So we have not put that into that, but that's one of the key things. So we haven't included advice around that, but one of the things is we don't want to disturb soil. So part of that is reducing your sealed surfaces, but we haven't, within this particular document, put that advice in.
Okay.
And just to add to that, I think there's a point to be made around design coding as well. So there's a linkage there between soil management and thinking about design codes and surfacing. So there's the links there that, again, you can be doing something with good design which actually has a secondary value around how you manage soils. So that's something that's worth bearing in mind.
Great, thanks, babe. And then I think we have now got to the final question. I'm just checking in the chat. Yeah, there's been discussion about that practice note and people kind of also saying, yeah, we're expecting updated version. So agreeing with you there. But yeah, just one question from Martin. Well, there's actually several questions here, so let me know if you need me to repeat any bits. Has there been consultation with consultants and construction partners? I think we saw from the first slide, there's been a lot of different people involved in this project and in the soils task force. Is there opportunity to gain expected outcomes without added burden? Have colleagues mapped the existing burden on multiple brackets disconnected and highly inefficient / duplicated sections, planning requirements for the sector and for planning committees to read / digest? As I said, there's a lot in there, so if you need me to repeat any bits, do let me know.
I think I'll just start, and then Susanna might want to come in. So yeah, I think going back to the first point, we've been very, very keen as part of the Soils Task Force to not produce documentation and policy which is unrealistic, unpragmatic. And to do that, we have engaged with a wide range of industry partners to gauge their views and incorporate them. So, we've talked to house builders, we've talked to minerals and waste haulage firms, a very wide range of kind of industry stakeholders to try and make sure that what we've been producing is something that by and large is in principle can be supported, and we think we've achieved that. Clearly, there'll always be individual cases where there will be friction and restrictions, and that will play out through the local plan process. I think just the other point to add around some of the second questions, it is about an educational thing. And we're very keen, for instance, this afternoon, we've got a member presentation on soil management, because I think, it's one thing for us as technical officers to understand the soil issue, but we need to tell communities about it. We need to engage with our elected members about it. And it's going to be an ongoing process for any local authority wanting to pick up the soil management issue. That point around education that Susanna made before is really, really key to understand people's views, understand experiences in terms of what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's going to be ongoing for some time. Susanna, I don't know if you've got anything to add there.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to it, just in terms of it, like being a burden, is I'd question if we can afford not to have good soil management on a site. So one of the things that through discussion is that often landscaping that's put in dies within 10 years on development sites because the soil has been so mistreated. If we've got a biodiversity duty and we have to have a management plan and that soil's been destroyed, how are we going to deliver on that? So this can really support that kind of ongoing maintenance and delivery of other statutory delivery areas. Or can we really afford to have a site that's so compacted that the water management is effective and people flood? So it's really a question of, we can do better, and how are we going to do that in a way which really supports development and makes it easy, and develops delivers those long-term outcomes for communities and the environment.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying there. Basically, soil is foundational, obviously, but it's foundational to the successful implementation of other environmental policies. Even just you say there about landscaping makes me think immediately about some of the conversations we've been having about B&G, and how you're going to get those gains to be kind of enforced for the 30-year time period. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point to end on. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Well, we're nearly at time, and that's everyone's questions. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much. Obviously, thank you to Susanna and Paul for coming and speaking to us today. I found that really interesting and really clear. So thank you so much for that. And obviously for all the work that you've put in the Soils Task Force into developing the guide in the first place. And thanks everyone, obviously, for coming and attending today and for asking questions and engaging.